Welcome. We are delighted to have Dr. Yael Ziegler here today with us, and I want to congratulate her on her new book on Eikha, Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about, we are in the 3 weeks, and we're going to talk a little bit about Eikha. And so I wanted to maybe start with the form and the style of Eikha. You know, there are lots of different ways to tell a story. Sometimes if we talk about even tragic events, we'll use statistics. We'll say, in the Holocaust, 6 million people were murdered. But Eikha doesn't do that. Eikha doesn't use statistics. It doesn't tell a narrative. Instead, it uses poetry. It uses poetry as a means. We talk about this book as a Sefer Kinot, a book of laments. So can you share with us and help us understand, why is this the appropriate way to tell the story of our national fall, our great tragedy? What's happening? What's the use of poetry here? How does it work?
Yeah, so poetry here seems to be designed to evoke emotion, right? The idea, I think, of Eikha is not to tell a story, as you noted. We don't have the story of the fall of Yerushalayim. In fact, we don't really even get a picture of that until Perek Bet. Right, in the second chapter of Eikha, we have this description, a very vivid description of the buildings falling, the Beit HaMikdash being destroyed, and the people falling alongside the buildings. But even that description, it's very poetic. And the idea of poetry, I think, is really to, not to tell a story, but to evoke the emotions of the reader who is experiencing the events. You know, every year on Tisha B'Av, we go into shul, we sit on the floor, we dim the lights, we hear the mournful tune of Eikha. And the idea is that everybody's supposed to be feeling the sadness that accompanied those events. The events themselves, I think, to some degree are secondary, which is, I think, part of the reason that Eikha also becomes a book which is useful beyond Tisha B'Av. It's not just about the events of 586 BCE.
So give us one example, maybe, where you really feel there is some powerful imagery, and we read this and it sort of throws us into it. Yeah.
So imagery is obviously a very important part of poetry, right? One of the things that we see is that, you know, when people discuss what defines poetry, when professors discuss what defines poetry, there's a whole range of definitions. But one thing that everybody agrees on is imagery, and there are some really powerful moments of imagery in Megillat Eikha. So, for example, when the narrator is turning to Yerushalayim and offering Yerushalayim some form of, not comfort, but empathy, right? Ma adamelach, right? What can I compare you to? With the idea, it's a rhetorical question. The idea is I can't compare you to anything. But then the narrator uses a very interesting piece of imagery, which is ki gadol kayam shivrech, right? As great as the sea is your brokenness. And the sea it's a tremendous image because it's wild and it's crashing and you can't find rest in it, right? You can't put an anchor in the sea and you can't cross it and you can't control it. And of course it's also made up of salt water, which evokes the enormous, the vast, copious, quantities of tears that accompany this story. I mean, Eikha is filled with tears, right? Bachotiv kebalayla, al eila nivochia, eini yordamayim, right? So then we have the tears in the sea, which really give you a sense that Yerushalayim's brokenness, it's beyond repair. Mi yir palach, who can possibly cure you, are the next words.
Wow. So these are really powerful images.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to throw at you a question which I've always had about poetry. You know, we're familiar with a lot of our tefillot, which use an aleph-bet pattern. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, V'chol Aminim, all these, they use an aleph-bet, and I've always thought that this is to help people remember them.
Yeah.
But it would feel that if I wanted to write poetry, I'd want to sort of have a free style to be able to use metaphor and allegory and all those things. And suddenly, we find in so many of the prakim of Eikha, it's written Perek Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, written on an Aleph Bet pattern, does that help the poetry or does that obstruct the poetry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's an important one, which is, of course, that, you know, the idea, one of the ideas of Eikha is that, you know, there's the idea of, and Chazal talk about this, the idea of totality, right? Me'alef ve'ad taf, right? We have this sense that, you know, Eikha is trying to describe something which is enormous, which is beyond our capacity to describe in mere words. I mean, you have similar things, I think, in other alphabetic structures. You mentioned vidui, right? You know, when I want to confess my sins on Yom Kippur, what I really want to say is the totality of sinfulness that we're feeling as we stand before God on Yom Kippur. So by using an aleph-bet structure, you're saying, really, I would like to use every word in the dictionary that could possibly describe my sins in the case of vidui, or my pain in the case of Eikha. And so it gives a certain ability to express totality without being there from morning to night. But the other thing, of course, and by the way, we have the same thing in Tilim Kuf Mem Hey, which is a description, it's a Shevach LaHashem, right? It's a
what we call Ashrei.
Right, what we call Ashrei, which starts, you know, with Tila David, but it also has an acrostic, an alphabetic acrostic. And there again, with the idea of describing God's praise, Ein L'Davar Sof, this has no end. So part of Eikha is trying to contain, you know, to offer a sense of totality, where, you know, obviously, you know, we don't want Eikha to become unwieldy. At the same time, of course, it also creates a certain structure within which we can express suffering, within which we can express pain. Because pain does need a structure, because otherwise it threatens to well up and pour out and overwhelm the individual. So this also creates, I think, something which is very useful for discussing suffering.
Thank you very much. So now we understand a little more about this totality, like the sea, but also which creates a framework. One of the metaphors that I really connect with is this idea of the darchei Tzion avelot, the notion of which we experienced a little bit with coronavirus, where you just see empty centers of cities. And then, if I can end off like we like to do sometimes on a good note, right? When it says, Mibli ba'i moed, at Chagim, nobody was coming to Aliyah L'Regel. And now, here in Israel, we have the biggest traffic jams on Chol HaMoed, where we can't get anywhere because of the traffic. Yes. So thank God, despite all of the tragedy, we can experience something different. It's the bracha of
Yeshayahu, right? When he describes the crowded conditions in Yerushalayim when we return, and he says to Yerushalayim, you're going to hear your children saying, Tsarli hamakom, Gishali ve'esheva, right? This place is too narrow for me. So sometimes when I sit in the traffic jams on the way to Yerushalayim, I think, Tsarli hamakom, this is our bracha, right? So I absolutely relate to what you're describing.